Okay. I think we can start now. Okay, welcome everyone once again. My name is Ngozi Ndeku. I am the most LCN coordinator, which is the Local Science Engagement Network coordinator. Today, we are going to be discussing tick-borne diseases in Missouri. And before we begin, I just want to read out some housekeeping items. Please, if your mic is not muted, please kindly mute. And during the course of the discussion, if you have any question that you want to ask the panelists, please do not hesitate to type your questions in the chat box. I'll be on the lookout for these questions. For our first timers who are just joining our roundtable section for the first time, I just want to give you an overview of what Most Policy Initiative is about. So Most Policy Initiative is a non-partisan, non-profit organization. Our mission is to promote long-term health, sustainability, economic growth for Missourians by connecting science to policy at both the state and local level. It's also very important to note that we are not a policy advocacy group. Our organization, as an organization, we aim to be honest brokers of quality information to inform evidence-based decision-making. However, the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network is a program under Most Policy Initiative that was co-founded with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. One of our goals through the monthly roundtable meetings we organize is to facilitate connections between our LCN members, community partners, researchers, and also policymakers in Missouri. So today we're going to be discussing tick-borne diseases in Missouri. So to kick off this amazing discussion, I would love our panelists to introduce themselves in just 1 to 2 minutes, a brief introduction about themselves and what their interest or work is. So I'll call on Matt first because you're the one I can see on my Zoom icon.
Yeah, I'm Matt Combs. I work for the Missouri Department of Conservation. I started my career doing stream monitoring and ecology of streams and stream pollution, and that recently the Department of Conservation put together a group of people in the science branch called the Ecological Health Unit that has the overall idea of combining forest health, wildlife health, environmental health, and stream health together in a group so that we think across all those potential borders instead of being bent in those ideas like we used to. So part of that is thinking about what citizens need, what information citizens need to be comfortable enjoying the outdoors and sort of a One Health framework. And one of the big things the department has heard in an increasing amount in the last 5 years is concerns about tick-borne disease. So I recently took on some tick-borne disease and tick population research. And so that's kind of why I'm here talking about the results of some of that research and some ways we could hopefully go forward to gather more information to make people feel more comfortable enjoying the outdoors.
Thank you, Matt. Sonny, you can go next.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Solney Adelsbenson, and I'm a staff scientist at Tyson Research Center, which is the environmental field station for Washington University in St. Louis. And so in this role, I direct a research lab that's largely focused on studying the ecology of tick-borne diseases. And I also work on wildlife conservation at the field station and the greater St. Louis region. I do a number of different things at the field station, including strategic planning and mentoring students and managing our participation in bigger data networks. And I also serve on the Tick Technical Working Group for the National Science Foundation's National Ecological Observatory Network, which is a continental scale observation facility aimed at tracking long-term ecological change. And so I've been studying ticks and tick-borne diseases for over 10 years now, but before that, I trained and worked professionally as a wildlife conservation biologist for several years in Iceland and the Hawaiian Islands. But my tick work really began on the East Coast, focusing on Lyme disease and looking at how urbanization and non-native plant invasion affects tick populations and the prevalence of the bacterium that causes Lyme. I came to Missouri in 2016 to begin a tick-borne disease research program. And my research now mainly focuses on how land management practices affect the ecology of tick-borne diseases. And so I use my background in wildlife ecology to try to study tick-borne diseases more holistically, understanding how ticks and their wildlife hosts interact within their environment, and what this means for pathogen transmission. So some of my core research projects and interests right now involve looking at how ticks and tick-borne pathogens are affected by prescribed fire, and also urbanization and connectivity in the St. Louis region. And I'm also working on some projects to better understand the ecology and transmission of these newly emerged viruses in ticks called Heartland and Bourbon virus. So yeah, I think that's probably, I'll leave it there for now, but I'm really excited to be part of the panel, and thank you again for the invitation to be here.
Thank you, Sony. Samnika, you can go next.
So hi, I'm Samnika Halsey. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I've been in Missouri for about 3 years, and I am an applied computational ecologist. So I tend to model tick-borne diseases. Most of my PhD work was modeling the ecology of Lyme disease and testing the mechanisms of the biodiversity disease relationships. And now I'm more focused on looking at how prairie restoration affects ticks and tick-borne diseases. So we sample small mammals, also conduct tick drags weekly for about 5 to 6 months each year, and just to see how that, just the dynamics of the restoration in a restoration versus a remnant prairie looks in respect to ticks and pathogens. So far we've been testing our ticks, and we've found rickettsia as well as ehrlichia. And we also found expansion of the Gulf Coast ticks here in Missouri, which was typically just found in the southern counties, but now it's in central Missouri.
Thank you, Samnika. Stephanie, you can go. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Foray. I'm a professor of biology at Truman State University. In 2006, I made a giant transformation in my research plan. I was aiming to find research that was cheap and would provide lots of research opportunities for undergraduates. So I started 2 long-term monitoring projects, one of which is to sample tick communities that are not on a host. So I call that the off-host monitoring project. And the other was to look at tick communities on small mammals. So we'll call those the on-host ticks. And I did, in fact, employ a fleet of undergraduate students to collect those ticks, ID those ticks, manage the data set, and then a subset of those also analyze data and publish their research. So that work started in 2006, and it stopped in 2019. Thank you, COVID.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. So to kick off our roundtable discussion today on tick-borne diseases in Missouri, we'll start by looking at the geographical distribution of ticks. So the first question will be, what are the different species of ticks and how are they geographically distributed in Missouri? And in addition to these, are there overlaps in this distribution of ticks in Missouri? Stephanie, you can go first.
So my work is focused in Adair County, which is in the northeast part of Missouri. But as part of some of our publication background research, we did look at the distribution of some ticks. And so the most common ticks, or the ticks that we catch in Adair County with our sampling methods, are the Lone Star tick, the American dog tick, and the black-legged ticks, and may also be known to you as the deer tick, and a few occasional rare other things that are like we would catch one or two other thing. I think that sometimes I switch into the Latin names. The Lone Star tick is broadly distributed throughout Missouri, and its range is expanding into as far as Minnesota. So it used to be called the southeastern tick, but it has become very common throughout much of the East Coast, all the way up into Minnesota and Maine. The American dog tick is also distributed, to my knowledge, throughout all of Missouri. The Lyme tick is creeping in. So at the moment, at least the last record I looked of somebody who was looking at the county distribution for the black-legged tick, it wasn't in all counties, but it was expanding.
Thank you, Stephanie. Is there anyone who wants to add to what Stephanie has said? You can.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that. We, Deb Hudman, who's on, is my partner at AT Still University. We have the statewide citizen science tick project going on, and in preparation for that, she gathered all of the published reports she could find of tick distributions in the state. And it's not much. If you look at those records, we have just a scattered representation of ticks throughout the state. But as Stephanie said, the Lone Star tick is likely statewide. American dog tick likely is too. Question about black-legged / deer tick, because white-tailed deer are everywhere. So it seems likely that deer tick could be everywhere, but we seem to get samples of them late in the year, later than most people drag for ticks. And then maybe the best way to get them is off of deer, which we have gotten some submitted to our program from hunters. We asked them to submit, and we got a large pulse of deer ticks records last year at deer season. So sample issues may obscure the distributions of some of these ticks. Gulf Coast tick was mentioned, and that's a relatively new one coming into the state from the southwest corner and moving across the Ozarks and now moving north. It is up about to the Missouri River everywhere, I'd say, and crossing and heading north. So I suspect that one will probably continue to expand. Brown dog tick is one that we've had submitted to our program, and it is one that's mostly focused in dog kennels. It doesn't go out into the landscape, but it can be a pest in dog kennels and can transmit dog diseases amongst dogs in kennel areas and some human diseases to humans. We've also had bat ticks submitted to our programs that people found in their houses after doing bat exclusions. Rabbit ticks from pet rabbits. And when we asked Missouri hunters to send us samples off of their deer, we got winter tick, which is another one that's in the state, but is not really a human biting one. So those are some of the native ones. And then of course, the big news is the Asian longhorn tick, the recent movement of that into Missouri from the south that last summer to the Springfield area and even clear up to, I think, the south end of Kansas City. I saw one report of. So those are some of the other ticks and their distributions and overlap.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. So the next question would be, what is the relationship between the prevalence of tick-borne diseases and different seasons? How does climate change affect the population dynamics of ticks? And what are the human activities and environmental factors that could impact the tick ecology? I think I will allow Samnika to take.
I'm not really much of the disease part. Sony, could you answer this one?
Sure, I'll be happy to jump in. I think it's fair to say that in Missouri, like many parts of the U.S., especially the eastern half of the U.S., the highest burden of tick-borne diseases in people is seen kind of in this span of the warmer months. And in Missouri, we're talking about March through October, which really corresponds to the Lone Star tick activity season. However, I always tell people around here that there's no season in Missouri that's not tick season. There are ticks active all year round, pretty much anytime it's above the freezing mark. So through the winter months, that's when we often see the black-legged ticks or deer ticks, at least in the St. Louis area. And so, and different tick species can transmit different pathogens, which cause different diseases, right? So there could be shifting patterns of disease seasonally, depending on which ticks are active at which time of the year. I think there are several other parts to that question. So maybe for the seasonal one, if anyone else wants to jump in, because I think there's a lot to unpack in the components of this question.
Thank you, Sony. Is there anyone who wants to expatiate further about how climate change affects the population dynamics of ticks?
So ticks are complex organisms with a long lifespan, longer than I would have imagined. And so I don't think that most people understand that ticks live like 2 to 3 years, which means that they have to overwinter at least 2 winters. And my primary study organism is the Lone Star tick, because I sample from February to December, I capture many thousand every year. And I get all 3 life stages of that particular tick. And one of the concerns that I have about the increasing climate, and so this is an untested hypothesis on my part, but in the spring, the adults come out and mate and lay their eggs, and the eggs hatch somewhere in July, August, September. And those larval Lone Star ticks have to find a blood meal before it freezes, because they are not very freeze tolerant. That's the only life stage of that tick that is fairly freeze intolerant. The other 2 life stages are very freeze tolerant. And with warmer climates in the late fall, early winter, I went hiking this Christmas with a t-shirt on in southern Iowa. I mean, so that allows more opportunities for those larvae to get that blood meal so that they can survive that first winter. And so the more larvae that make it to spring, the bigger your other 2 populations of ticks are going to be over time.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. So looking into how do human activities and then environmental factors affect impact the tick ecology. I don't know if someone can expatiate more on this. Sonny, do you want to say something about this?
Sure. This is an area I think a lot about. There are lots of examples out there of how different ways that we've altered our environment can affect the ecology of the ticks themselves or the hosts that they feed on, with different implications for the risk of tick-borne diseases to humans. So one area that I've worked on in the past has to do with invasive plant species. I worked on this back east and we saw a similar effect, but this has been done by Brian Allen and some colleagues a number of years ago in Missouri, showing that this invasive understory shrub known as bush honeysuckle, a really prevalent invader in forest ecosystems in Missouri, They showed that this invasive plant species can locally increase the densities of Lone Star ticks, and the Lone Star ticks that haven't yet fed and are out there looking for a host to feed on, and those are the ones that are a risk to humans. So that's one way in which changes to our local ecosystems can impact our risk of disease. Back east, there are a number of examples, not with Lone Star tick, but with black-legged ticks or deer ticks, showing kind of similar effects with other invasive plant species like multiflora rose, which is related to our ornamental roses, and then Japanese barberry, which out here is actually still a pretty popular landscape plant. You can go out and buy it at Home Depot today, and that plant can very easily move from suburban backyards into adjacent natural areas and invade and change the local habitat conditions to make them more favorable for tick survival.
Thank you, Sony. Thank you. So next question would be, what other animals contribute to the life cycle of tick-borne diseases? I know we've mentioned tick, but then I know some animals also contribute to the life cycle of these tick-borne diseases. Can anyone talk about these, and also how can human activities expose an individual to tick bites?
So I could take this one. So one of the things, ticks are pretty generalist. They'll pretty much feed on anything that they attach to attain a blood meal. So for the most part, like I trap small mammals, so mice, voles. We know that ticks occur on white-tailed deer. When I did a meta-analysis as a PhD, we found that the black-legged tick is on over 150 different species. So birds, reptiles, small mammals, medium-sized mammals, black bears, wolves, coyotes, like all those things. So they feed on pretty much anything. So but those hosts serve as different, let's say like high quality or low quality. So some animals have different, we call it host permissiveness. So some of them are better groomers than others. So if a tick was to try to feed on a white-footed mouse or deer mouse, it'll be more likely to get that blood meal and survive and continue to be a nymph. But then if a tick was to feed on a raccoon or a possum, those are low permissive or maybe low quality. So then they're more likely to be groomed off and die. So the types of animals that we have in the environment will greatly affect how many ticks we have. So if we have a lot of animals, a high diversity of animals that are either good groomers or bad groomers, that can affect the population size of the ticks. These animals are also different. They might not be as competent for the bacteria. So some of the animals might have Ehrlichia or Rickettsia or Lyme disease, Borrelia, but some of them might not. So it just depends on whether or not the tick is feeding on that host, and if it's infected at that time, whether or not the disease will be transmitted.
Thank you, Samnika. Is there anyone that wants to add anything to what Samnika has said? If not.
Yeah, the ticks are also found on reptiles and birds, just so everybody knows.
Thank you, Matt.
I thought I said reptiles and birds, but okay. I might have forgotten that in all those lists of things.
Sorry, my internet keeps glitching, so you may have said that in the 3 seconds I wasn't able to hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Oh, I guess I could also answer the next part of about the human activities. So just being outside, gardening, hiking, just anywhere. If you're surrounded by vegetation, and it doesn't just have to be forest vegetation, it could be prairie vegetation or grasses. So those are things that can expose individuals to tick bites. So like one thing that I always say when I end presentation is like the best way to prevent Lyme disease or tick-borne disease is just to check yourself for ticks anytime you go outside. So engaging in those personal protective behaviors can stop transmission of disease to humans.
Thank you, Samnika. So moving on to the next question. What are the symptoms of tick-borne diseases and the possible complications that could emerge if this tick-borne disease is not properly managed? Anyone can take this.
I think we're all hedging a little bit because none of us are physicians, but I'm happy to talk generally with the disclaimer that I'm not a medical doctor. But I think one of the tricky things with tick-borne diseases is it's often a sort of vague suite of symptoms that can be really similar to many other types of illnesses. So one of the things I always tell people is if they notice a tick bite, make sure you note when that happened, and then you can be able to inform your physician when you do go to the doctor and report these symptoms that you have had a tick exposure, and that will lead them down a different line of inquiry than they might otherwise. So generally, we're talking about sort of flu-like symptoms with many of these tick-borne illnesses. So fatigue, fever, body aches. Some of these diseases present with rashes, but not all, and not necessarily consistently. And then some can be very serious if left untreated, and lead to things like organ failure or neurological symptoms. There are these two new tick-borne viruses that we don't yet know a whole lot about yet, but they have been associated with some cases of severe illness and death. We still don't know yet what percentage of patients really experience the most severe impacts of those, but there's a lot to learn still about many of these diseases.
Thank you, Son. Does anybody want to add anything? If not, I can just move to the next question. Okay, that's fine. So moving on to the next question, what is the impact of tick spread on food production, taking into consideration farming activities and livestock production? And also, what's the impact of ticks on pets? People have cats and dogs. What impact does tick have on their pets too?
I can share a little bit of information about that. Deb Hudman, who's on this, is one of our audience members, did a survey through the health departments in North Missouri, just surveying people who are frequently exposed to ticks about their number of bites per year, and if they've ever displayed any symptoms, and then if they ever sought help for it. And it was, I can't remember the exact numbers, but most farmers and resource professionals in North Missouri have had multiple tick bites, up to 17 per year. Almost, 75% or so of those folks report having the symptoms, and then like 10% go to get it looked into by their doctor. And so that's why we need to have these kind of discussions and raise awareness and have our statewide tick surveys and stuff, because folks potentially aren't taking it serious enough, and those folks are, in a lot of cases, are farmers. And so that can, I think, begin to affect our food production ability as people get sick and maybe miss planting and that sort of thing. The other thing I recently read was that, just reading about the Asian longhorn tick, since it showed up, and one thing that happened when it showed up when it colonized Australia, was their net cow herd gross national productivity went down in a measurable way in 10 years of the tick hitting the island or the subcontinent. So ticks, at least the Asian longhorn tick, which is, it vectors a whole bunch of veterinary diseases, and it prefers cattle as a host. I think it caused Australia's ability to produce beef to go down in a way that could be measured in their economy. So that is a potential threat here as well.
Thank you, Matt. Is there anyone that wants to contribute to it, like the impact on pets? Stephanie, is there something you want to say about that?
Well, Solney's the Lyme, and maybe Samanika is the Lyme experts, but if you live on the East Coast, I mean, they have developed vaccines for Lymes for dogs, and I'm not sure if they also give those to cats, but that's a big economic cost for pets and people, that's a $1 billion business economic loss, that particular disease on the East Coast. So it's pretty expensive to treat people and pets for that, and the loss of work. And
Oh, go ahead. Were you going to jump in, Matt? I was going to say something too, but you can go.
There was an outbreak of Bobcat Fever in Southwest Missouri last year. Just a few individuals sick with Bobcat Fever, but that's something that can go from wild bobcats to tame cats. And it's a disease that isn't necessarily thought of when a sick animal shows up at a veterinary office. It takes a while to diagnose it. So that's another one that can be bad for pet cats.
Yeah, I was going to mention that one. And then also with the livestock issue, I know with the Gulf Coast tick in other regions, that has been shown to have some negative impacts on livestock. They can create a lot of inflammation on livestock where they've bitten and create lesions that then can make livestock vulnerable or susceptible to other diseases or other parasites, and cause an economic loss that way. And I know, Lyme disease, of course, our dogs are vulnerable to, but dogs can get other tick-borne diseases that humans can get as well, including ehrlichiosis. And then the other thing I thought might be worth mentioning is alpha-gal syndrome. So there is a tick-borne disease that seems to be associated with a bite from the Lone Star tick, which sensitizes people to have allergic reactions when they consume mammalian meats. So that's mainly, your pork or beef products, and also any byproducts of containing those tissues. So things like pharmaceuticals that are developed using animal tissues. And so it's not directly talking about food production, but maybe more of the consumer habits. There are a large number of folks now kind of in the Southeast, really overlapping with that Lone Star tick range, that now have, in some cases, extreme sensitivities to these mammalian products.
Thank you, Sonny. There's a question in the chat concerning these pets. So before we move on, just to get to it, Linda is asking, is there any info on feral house cats as tick hosts? And also, are wild turkey, chickens, and ducks tick eaters?
I would say, in my experience, chickens are fabulous tick eaters in my yard anyway, and many wild birds eat ticks whenever they can get a beakful of them.
No, but wild turkeys are also hosts for lots of amblyomma, or sorry, Lone Star ticks.
Then I don't know anything in particular about feral house cats as tick hosts, but I don't see how they could get away from them.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat. Before we move to solutions, there's another question in the chat from Leslie Brooks. She's asking, she said she was once told that one reason why Lyme disease was typically limited to the northeastern part of the United States was because of the limited geographic range of the intermediate host, which is the white-footed mouse. So her question is, has their range been spreading? And what's the main driver for this? And is this comment true? Are these facts true? Yeah.
I'll be happy to take this one, having worked on Lyme disease, but feel free to jump in.
Well, I will just, the only thing I want to say is the 99% of my small mammal cancer is the white-footed mouse. So
yeah, we certainly have them here.
I don't think that that's a very good reason.
Yeah, I mean, Leslie has it correct about the distribution of Lyme disease. It's mainly in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. And The leading hypothesis for that, as I understand it, there was actually a large grant to study this exact question just a few years ago. And it's really interesting, right? Because we have the white-footed mice across this whole range, the whole eastern half of the US, even where Lyme's not that prevalent. We have the vector, the black-legged tick, that's certainly in Missouri. I catch them all the time on animal hosts. And the bacterium is here as well, but we just don't have that much Lyme disease here and elsewhere in the southern half of the eastern US. And so the leading hypothesis now is actually comes down to different behaviors in the ticks in the north and south. So as recently as the 90s, this black-legged tick was actually considered two separate species in the north and the south, and they are genetically distinct, but we've since decided that they're all one species and lumped them back together. But they're different enough genetically that they also display these different behaviors. And the black-legged tick or deer tick in the southern half of this range, they don't, when they're looking for a host, we call it questing in the tick biology world, but when they're out looking for a host in the south, they don't move up as high on vegetation as they do in the north. And I mean, this seems like a really minor thing, right? But it actually changes their susceptibility to get onto human hosts really significantly. So in the southern half of this range, people are hardly ever bitten by the black-legged tick or deer tick compared to how often they're bitten by this tick in the north. And so it really comes down to this behavioral difference in the tick. And so there's still lots of questions about the drivers of that behavior. It might come down to microclimate factors or factors related to different host preferences. But yeah, ultimately the ticks actually behave different in the southern versus the northern edge of the range.
I also wanted to add to that, a lot of the when we think of like biases towards blaming the white-footed mice, it is kind of because most of the research is really easy to catch white-footed mice. You put out a Sherman trap, they love the peanut butter or oats. And so when you find all these white-footed mice with ticks, you assume that that's the cause, even though over 150 species, reptiles, birds, mammals have the tick. I looked at I did a meta-analysis over the last 50 years for the black-legged tick and Lyme disease. And we found out that most of the studies were in the Northeast and the Midwest, because we tend to focus on when there's a health problem, we go out and look from there. So we were not really looking in the South. So there's like few studies in the South that have been published as of 2014. There's been more studies, but the cutoff for when I was doing my research was 2014. And there was actually only one study in Missouri, which was on a black bear. So now we've have this more research to say, okay, they're now on these other hosts, they have the bacteria, and now we can try to figure out why humans are not. So I think for my data set, 50%, so there were about 190,000 animal captures. 50% of those were white-tailed deer. 50% were white-footed mouse, 40% were white-tailed deer, and then 10% were the other 148 species. So we just wasn't focusing on these other animals, but we're now finding out that they are more important than we typically thought.
Thank you, Samnika. So moving on to solutions to this tick-borne disease. There's a question in the chat before I ask the questions I have right here. William Falk is asking, are there evidence-based means of biological control of ticks? Anyone can answer.
That's a great question. There has been work done on fungal pathogens that are lethal for ticks. I'm not up on the latest, to be honest, but the last that I really was looking into this, it seemed to be an issue of scale and being able to apply it widely enough to have an impact at the population level. But perhaps another panelist has more to say.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things that we've tried. Like Sonia was mentioning that she looks at fire and how that affects tick distributions. There's like mowing, just controlling vegetation. I know in California, they're dealing with the Pacific, is it the black-legged? There's a tick species, Exodes Pacific, I can't remember the common name, but they noticed that in like California, lizards actually will clear the infections. So it's not I don't think of it as we have a tick problem, we have a pathogen problem, because I think we wouldn't care so much if, I don't know if anyone would agree, if there were ticks. The problem is that they're transmitting these pathogens. So we could figure out a way to prevent them from transmitting these pathogens, then we will be okay. So I'm also looking at like trying to figure out what are some management methods to prevent tick-borne diseases or tick bites. And I know recently the CDC, their aim right now for nationwide, so they're trying to fund grant senders, vector-borne disease centers to find management actions or actions to prevent vector bites. So hopefully in the future, we will have more research done to try to figure out how we can prevent these ticks, mosquitoes, fleas from biting humans, some effective evidence-based practices.
Thank you, Samnika. Thank you, Sony. Moving on to the next question. So currently, Missourians are being asked to mail tick samples. How are this data that is being collected from these tick samples, how will it be used to understand and manage tick-borne diseases? In addition to this, are there other ways for scientists, decision makers, community members to work together to understand the tick-borne diseases? I think, Matt, I'll allow you take this, and then any other person can add to it.
Yeah, so I'm one of the two principal investigators on the statewide citizen science tick project, working with A.T. Still University and Deb Hudman. And we've just, asked citizens to mail ticks to her, and then she's trying to screen 10 adults of each of the 4 main human biting species in each county in the state. So the first step in it is to try to generate a map of where the species occur, or the most likely to occur, because that map simply didn't occur in the past in any good form. And then to also try to map the spread of the diseases or the bacterial pathogens that cause the diseases in those ticks as well. So this is our second summer of the data of tick collection. And last year, I think Deb put in the comments that we got over 13,000 ticks so far, which is way more than we ever thought we would get when we started this. And we got a whole nother summer of data collection to go, so we might get 26,000. We don't know, but that's a whole lot of ticks and a whole lot of opportunity to look at the bacterial pathogens in them. The project is being updated weekly on a website at A.T. Still University. You have it in the materials for the meeting. It's atsu.edu/ticks. Will take you to the project page, and there's a lot of maps there that are updated weekly by Deb that show, you can click on a county and it'll tell you how many of which species of ticks we found. And you can go to another section and look at, has tabs by tick, and you can look at the pathogens found in them by county and number. So we already have that information building on the website. The data will be used just to help spread understanding of ticks. When we started this project, we got together a group of folks. It ended up being MDs, the Department of Conservation, Department of Health and Senior Services staff, one state parks representative was there, and a few other folks. And we talked about, what is the biggest need for tick research in the state, and it ended up being just the basic map of where the ticks are, because it didn't exist at the time. And so we're glad we'll be getting a good long ways into making that map, so we can see what happens in the future, right? See if the Gulf Coast ticks spread, if something else shows up and spreads through the state. But then the disease, the pathogen information will also be used to, we're going to make it available through the Department of Health and Senior Services to the health departments to share with physicians, because I'm not sure a lot of physicians understand that maybe ehrlichiosis is the big problem and not Lyme's disease. I'll talk to several physicians that I know, and that they sort of at this point are just still grouping all tick-borne illnesses together as tick disease and not looking into particularly what you're infected with. And that can be important because your outcome can be determined by knowing which pathogen you have, if you go to that level of testing to find that out. So presenting a map that shows the distribution of the pathogens to the making it publicly accessible so the physicians can look at it will hopefully make them think more about what their patients might have and whether there's better treatments that will have better results for the patients. Then the public, of course, is welcome to look at it too and understand what's going on in the area that they're at. They can potentially look at the number of species of ticks they might be encountering on their walks and the potential for pathogens in them. And of course, we've got to accompany that with advice on how to avoid getting bitten, what to do if you get sick. So that is how the data will be used to understand a tick-borne disease and to manage them through physicians. I might take a stab at the sub question, but definitely want other people's input on that one as well. There are many ways for scientists and decision makers and community members to work together to understand the diseases. One is to like we already are, we're doing that right now. And awareness is a huge part of this right now because it seems like we're so far behind the curve on tick illness. It's like this, I think, growing thing, and yet awareness isn't growing fast enough to keep up with it. So we have to work together to develop the key information needs and then present those back to the public and develop the solutions we need to keep people outside enjoying nature, because we don't want people to give up the healthy benefits of going outside and exercising and having reduced stress as they walk through trees because of fear of tick-borne illness. Instead, we need to develop the ways to manage our public properties to reduce their risk of exposure and then give them advice on what they can do on their persons to make sure that they don't get exposed, and the knowledge to talk to their doctors if they do feel they've been exposed and may have the disease. And I will let other folks weigh in on that.
Thank you, Mart. Does anybody want to add to that about the collaboration between scientists, decision makers, and community members to work together to understand tick-borne diseases?
I'm sorry, Samika, go ahead.
Yeah, so I will echo what Matt said. I would also think that I think the working together part is very crucial, that we can't solve this problem alone. So like when we as ecologists are doing, we need to think of it from that social sciences part. So including social scientists who have more of the experience of, creating surveys, trying to figure out evidence-based ways of determining impact. And then just with community members, just learning how to engage. So like, I really like this, that this will hopefully be out to the community where we're intentionally trying not to use jargon when we're speaking about these diseases or or species, and them also just engaging with us. So if you get a survey about tick-borne diseases, fill it out. If someone contacts you and wants to conduct a tick drag on your property, say yes, so we can see what ticks are there. I think those are ways that we can help understand tick-borne diseases in Missouri and figure out a solution together to solve it.
Thank you, Samika. So moving on to the next question. Are there existing policies in Missouri that support tick management strategies? Does anybody have any idea?
I guess when we had our initial meeting to talk about tick research, and Department of Health and Senior Services mentioned that they have trouble doing tick research because their budget is earmarked for mosquito. Their vector-borne budget is earmarked for mosquito control to such a degree that they have a hard time redirecting their funds into tick research. So that is an existing policy that may prohibit management strategies, but so that's one policy level thing. Other policies that we have in place are, most departments that manage land do have the ability to prescribe fire. and it's a way to treat, like some of our burn units in the Ozarks are over 1,000 acres in one burn. And so it's a really effective way to treat 1,000 acres in one day for ticks, assuming that the fire controls the ticks, which there is evidence for, in a divided evidence, but it seems to be site specific, but there is evidence that it can control ticks. So those are good policies. We also, in the Department of Conservation, have a policy where we have our private land staff who can also train private landowners to burn their own land in a controlled way that's safe for everybody. And one side effect to that is the control of ticks, although the main thrust of it is to control non-native vegetation and to increase biodiversity of native plants, which happens to be a really good environment for reducing ticks as well. So those are some of the policies I can think of that are affecting tick management at a large scale in the state.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Matt.
I'm glad. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, Matt, because that was on my mind too. That there was recent legislation just passed in 2021, making it easier to do prescribed burns and reducing liability for landowners engaging in burns. And it seems to be effective on a short-term scale, but we have so much to learn still about how to design an effective burn regime for tick control and reduction of tick-borne disease risk. That's something I'm working on. I think Samnika is working on it too within the prairie context. So yeah, I would love to see a more focused and coordinated effort around that. And maybe that's an avenue tying back in with the last question. For more cooperation among scientists and community members, because the community members know where they're encountering the ticks in their own life, especially landowners or farmers that spend a lot of time outdoors. And so if there are folks doing prescribed burns or trying other management techniques on their property, I think it'd be a fantastic way to tie in and work together to figure out which burn regimes work the best for controlling ticks.
thank you, Sonia. Just going to be the last question before we wrap up. Sonia, since you're already on one of the preventive measures, so just what preventive measures can be taken at the individual, community, and state level, like to help control the spread of these tick-borne diseases in Missouri?
Yeah, I'd say at a broad scale, I would really love to see statewide coordinated surveillance. The project that Matt and Deborah are doing is fantastic and getting us so much more information than we've ever had about ticks in Missouri. As an addition to that, I would love to see more surveys statewide of the free living ticks as they occur in the environment and support for that, both at the state level and local levels through government and through communities. If we can learn more about the tick populations across the state and how they're changing and what pathogens they have, we can start using targeted management strategies. Things like prescribed fire or invasive plant removal or host targeted approaches maybe. And so just getting to that point where we know so much more about the ticks in Missouri, the tick-borne diseases, and are able to educate folks about the risks and how to take the proper precautions to still enjoy the outdoors, but protect themselves from these diseases. That would go a long way.
Thank you, Sonia. Is there anything anyone wants to add? If not, we just wrap up.
I would like to add that I read a paper once where the Department of Defense contracted a contractor to look at ticks around one of their large bases and develop a plan for vegetation management for them. I think we could do that on a lot of Missouri state property where we target where people are using the most, and that's where we mow the most, sort of thing, because as when you reduce that vegetation back to below ankle height, you're severely reducing the risk of getting crawled up on by a tick. And so that's just one large scale thing I think that all departments could think about pursuing at the statewide scale.
Thank you, Matt. So to wrap up, to wrap up in the last 3-4 minutes, I want each of the panelists just what's your key takeaway that scientists or science advocates could share with their local officials related to tick-borne diseases? One thing people would just, scientists could just share with their local officials related to tick-borne diseases in Missouri. Stephanie, you can start.
Yeah, I was just getting ready to fill in here. I think what I would like policy people to understand is the complexity of tick-borne diseases. It's I was just talking to a friend today that we have forgotten that COVID is a disease that jumped from animal to humans. It's because it's now going human to human, but you know, with tick-borne diseases, we're talking about ticks and one or more animal hosts that, and one of those often serves as the reservoir for the pathogen. And so to understand this control, we have to think not just about the tick and the human, but we have to think about those hosts and the reservoir hosts for the pathogens.
Thank you, Stephanie. Samnika, you can go next.
I think so. Like my key takeaway, and it's a little self-serving as a scientist who does research on ticks and tick-borne diseases, but they're understudied in Missouri, and we need the funding to survey them to find out where they are, which ones are affected, and how many. So which ticks are infected with what pathogens. How many people are affected where, so we can learn and understand and reduce it. So I think the key takeaway is that we just need more money to do the research.
Thank you. Sonny, you can go next.
Yeah, I think I'd like to echo what Samnika and Stephanie just said, and maybe kind of tie them together, because maybe local lawmakers aren't always aware that just within the last 10 years, Missouri has seen the emergence of 2 new tick-borne viruses. They emerged in this region, not so differently from thinking about, as Stephanie brought up, COVID jumping from wildlife hosts into humans. So here's another example right in our backyard where we've had spillover of novel viruses from probably wildlife host reservoirs. We don't even know which one it is yet, but via ticks into humans. And so we desperately need more research in our region to understand the full scale of the threat of tick-borne diseases. And that means funding the research and investing more in statewide surveillance so we can anticipate the next tick-borne disease to emerge.
Thank you. And lastly, Matt, you can give your key takeaway.
Yeah, just to build on what everybody else has said, one way to accomplish a lot of this would be to support the Tick Act. For over 10 years, there's been some version of a draft bill before Congress to create the centers that Somanika was talking about. So in other words, dedicated long-term funding for tick research centers around the country. And so if our Missouri policymakers would begin to support the Tick Act, I think that might be a good way to get that funding that we're talking about missing and allow us to step up the scale of research that we need to get to, because a lot of tick research is so local in its nature that it's hard to draw broad conclusions when you're just looking at 20 studies from 20 results from 20 different studies. Whereas if you do it all at the same time with the same methods, it makes much better results. So that's my advice to policymakers: support the Tick Act.
Thank you so much, our wonderful panelists. It was a very informative discussion, and also to our participants who tuned in to listen to this, we say a very big thank you. During the course of the discussion, 2 community science notes were shared in the chat box that was written by Leslie Brook, Bertin Berrigan, and Prema Arasu. Please try and read this community science note, and also help to share with people out there to increase the awareness of the spread of tick-borne disease and the management of tick-borne diseases. On that note, till we meet again next month, I'll leave you guys to enjoy your wonderful afternoon. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much for supporting the Missouri LCN. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.